Have you ever wondered what someone might choose to eat for their very last meal? Especially if they're on death row? It's a curious thing, isn't it? Well, get ready, because today we're delving into some truly peculiar last meal requests made by inmates facing their final moments. It's a mix of strange, surprising, and even a little bit funny. Are you ready to explore this fascinating topic with us? Let's dig in. Charles Rumbaugh. Charles Rumbaugh, a man who had a very different idea about his final dinner. So, who was Charles Rumbaugh? Well, he was a troubled young man who was convicted of a robbery and murder when he was just 17 years old. He spent almost 10 years in prison before it was time for his execution. Now, when it came to his last meal, most people might think he'd choose something fancy or extravagant. But Charles had a different plan. He decided to keep it really simple. You won't believe what he chose. A single flour tortilla. Yes, you heard that right. Just one plain tortilla. Now, flour tortillas are usually used to wrap up tasty fillings like meat, cheese, or veggies. But Charles didn't want anything fancy with his tortilla. He just wanted to eat it plain, with nothing on it. And to wash it down, he asked for a glass of water, the simplest drink you can imagine. You might be wondering why he made such a simple choice. Well, some people think it reflects Charles's state of mind at the time. He was probably thinking about bigger things than food as he faced his final moments. Maybe he wanted to keep things simple and straightforward, just like his meal choice. Velma Barfield. Velma Barfield made a surprising choice for her final meal before her execution in 1984. Instead of a hearty meal, she opted for snacks from a vending machine. She could have chosen anything for her last meal, but she asked for just one can of Coca-Cola and a bag of cheese doodles. Velma Barfield was in a North Carolina prison where inmates could request a special final meal. Despite the option to have a more substantial meal, she decided on snacks. It's not clear why she made this choice, but the prison respected her request. Barfield, who was 52 years old at the time, enjoyed her snacks before her execution. Before her death, Barfield had been serving a life sentence for poisoning at least 4 people, including her boyfriend. She tried to appeal her conviction, but her efforts were unsuccessful. When she was executed, she became the first woman to be executed in the United States since 1962 and the first female prisoner to die by lethal injection. Kenneth Wayne Morris. Kenneth Wayne Morris had a really tough 38th birthday. Why? Because it was also the day he was scheduled to be executed in Texas. Can you imagine? So, for his last meal, he picked something pretty surprising but kind of fitting. A birthday cake. Yeah, you heard that right. He wanted a white cake with lemon icing to mark the occasion. It might sound a bit strange, but think about it. This was his last chance to have cake before he died. Along with the cake, he asked for fried chicken and fried okra. Normally, inmates have their last meals the night before they're executed, but in this case, Kenneth got his birthday lunch and cake around midday, and then they executed him that evening. Before all this happened, Kenneth Morris had a rough past. He was a career criminal, meaning he had been doing crimes for a long time. Mostly, he did burglaries, which sometimes turned violent. But his last crime was really terrible. It was a home invasion that ended with someone getting killed. Even though his friends who helped him got lighter punishments, Kenneth got the harshest one because he was the one who did the murder. He spent about 15 years in prison before they ran out of ways to appeal his case, both in Texas and even in the U.S. Supreme Court. Stacy Lawton. Stacy Lawton had a unique last meal request before his execution in 2000. He was in Texas, and he was sentenced to death for a serious crime he committed in 1992. That day, he and his friends were caught by the police after a fast chase in a stolen truck. Lawton got the death penalty because he was involved in shooting someone during a robbery. Even though he said he didn't do the shooting, the courts didn't believe him, and he stayed on death row for 7 years without winning any appeals. Now, about his last meal, Lawton's choice might sound strange to many. Along with a regular cheeseburger and fries, he asked for something extra special. A whole jar of dill pickles. Dill pickles are usually eaten with burgers because they add a salty and sour taste that many people like. But eating a whole jar at once is quite unusual. It seems like Lawton really loved those pickles and felt his last meal wouldn't be complete without them. Gerald Lee Mitchell. Gerald Lee Mitchell, a person on death row in Texas, made a surprising choice for his last meal. When asked what he wanted to eat before his execution, he requested a whole bag of assorted Jolly Rancher candies. Now, most people wouldn't think of candy as a meal, especially for their last one, but Mitchell thought differently. Mitchell's choice might seem strange, but it could have held some meaning for him. He was only 17 years old when he committed a terrible crime, shooting and killing 3 people with a shotgun. Despite admitting to his actions, he was sentenced to death. Even though his lawyer argued that his age at the time should be considered, Texas law allowed for the death penalty for someone his age. So, Mitchell spent almost half his life on death row before he was executed at the age of 33. It's unclear whether Mitchell finished eating the whole bag of Jolly Rancher candies before his execution, but his unusual choice for a last meal certainly stands out among the many requests made by inmates on death row. Victor Feger. Victor Feger, a person who was going to be punished for his crimes, had a different idea for his last meal. He was in Iowa in the 1960s, facing punishment for kidnapping and killing a local doctor. He wasn't free for long before the police caught him. He didn't hide what he did and admitted to everything. Feger's case is notable because he was the last person executed in Iowa before they stopped using the death penalty in 1965. Now, about his last meal choice. It wasn't something delicious or comforting. Feger asked for just one olive, and he wanted the pit to be still in it. Why such a strange choice? Well, olives are often linked with peace. Feger hoped that by having an olive with its pit, a tree would grow from his grave, which he thought symbolized peace. The prison staff granted his request shortly before his execution, and they even found the olive pit in his burial clothes afterward. While this meal might have had a deep meaning for Feger, it's definitely not what most people would choose for their last meal. It's interesting to see how different people make choices even in such serious situations. John William Elliott. John William Elliott had a very specific last meal request before his execution. Instead of just asking for any food, he asked for something very particular. He wanted a cup of hot tea made from tea bags, not just any tea, and he wanted 6 chocolate chip cookies to go with it. That might sound like a normal snack to some, but it's a bit unusual to be so specific when it's your last meal. Elliott's story is a sad one. He was sentenced to die by lethal injection in 2003, almost 20 years after he was found guilty of beating a young woman to death in the late 1980s. His 2 accomplices testified against him, leading to his conviction. Elliott had both British and American citizenship, but he only talked to British media while he was in prison. In Texas, where he was imprisoned, many people supported his execution, but people in Britain mostly disagreed with his conviction and punishment. His choice of tea and cookies for his last meal might have been a way for him to remember his childhood. He grew up on a U.S. military base in Great Britain, so maybe those flavors reminded him of home.
Bruno Richard Hauptmann.
Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a prisoner known for his involvement in the Lindbergh kidnapping case back in the 1930s, had a peculiar last meal before his execution. You see, when inmates are given the chance to choose their final meal, it's a big deal. It's like their last chance to enjoy some of their favorite foods before they're gone forever. Now, Hauptmann's last meal was quite interesting. Instead of just picking one dish, he went for a mix of different foods. He chose French fries and chicken, which are pretty common choices among inmates. But here's where it gets weird. He also asked for cherries, olives, buttered peas, and plain celery. These veggies don't really go together with the fries and chicken, right? It's like he was picking things randomly. And for dessert, he kept it simple with just a piece of cake. So, it's a bit of a mystery why Hauptmann chose such a random assortment of foods for his last meal. Maybe he just wanted to enjoy some of his favorite things one last time, even if they didn't exactly match. Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh, a prisoner in Oklahoma, had a peculiar request for his last meal before his execution in 2001. Instead of asking for a full meal, he wanted something sweet. So, he asked for not just one, but 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. That's a lot of ice cream to eat at once, but hey, it's his last meal, right? It's kinda sad to think about, but people often choose their favorite foods for their final meal. Now, you might be wondering who Timothy McVeigh was. Well, he's sadly famous for something terrible. In 1995, he did a horrible thing. He bombed a federal building in Oklahoma City, and because of that, he's known as the Oklahoma City Bomber. It was one of the worst acts of terrorism ever in the United States. After McVeigh finished his ice cream, he spent his last night watching TV and trying to sleep. The next day, he was given a lethal injection and passed away. Even though he's been gone for over 20 years now, what he did still sticks in people's minds. And his choice of ice cream for his last meal is just one more strange thing about him that people talk about. Those were some really weird and interesting last meal requests, weren't they? It's amazing to see what people choose to eat before saying goodbye. Even though these stories might seem strange, they show us that everyone is unique, even in their final moments. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the curious world of last meals on death row. We hope you found it as fascinating as we did. See you next time.